Nathan Cole walked into Rosewood Restaurant at 7 o'clock on a Tuesday night, wearing his best shirt, the one Claire had ironed for him, without being asked, with his hair combed back, for the first time in longer than he could remember. Across the room, Diane Calloway had already claimed a corner table near the window, a leather notebook open in front of her, and a black pen resting between her fingers, like she had done this 100 times before. Neither of them knew the other existed. Neither of them had any idea they had been arranged, guided, and quietly maneuvered into the same room by people who thought they knew better. And by the time they both figured out what was happening, the breadbasket was already half empty, and something had shifted between them that neither of them was quite prepared to name. Nathan Cole was 42 years old and had the hands of a man who built things for a living. Wide-palmed, calloused at the knuckles, always carrying the faint shadow of work that couldn't quite be scrubbed away by the end of the day. He was a senior structural engineer at Kellerman and Associates, a mid-sized infrastructure firm in Chicago, the kind of man whose colleagues described as reliable before they described him as anything else. He drove a 2014 Civic with a cracked rear bumper he kept meaning to fix, packed his own lunch every morning in a blue thermos container that had seen better days, and took the same route to work every single day, because his daughter Claire had once told him that consistency made her feel safe. That had been enough reason to keep doing it forever. Claire was 13 and had her mother's eyes and her father's stubborn silence when something was bothering her. She had been 9 years old when Laura died pancreatic cancer fast and merciless, the kind that doesn't give a family much time to adjust to what's coming, and in the 4 years since she had become both younger and older than her age, in ways Nathan noticed and ached over quietly. She still slept with a worn stuffed rabbit on the pillow beside her, but she had also started setting 2 alarms each morning so that her father's coffee was ready before he came downstairs. She had started checking the weather app the night before to remind him whether to bring an umbrella. She worried in ways no child her age should have to, and Nathan carried that knowledge like a stone in his chest that he could never quite put down. Diane Calloway was 39 CFO of Meridian Logistics, and the kind of person who made rooms quieter the moment she entered them. Not unfriendly colleagues would never have described her that way, but precise in the way that certain people are precise, where every sentence does exactly what it needs to do, and nothing beyond that. She had been married for 6 years to a man named Paul, who told her near the end that her ambition made it difficult for him to feel needed around her. She had been standing in the kitchen holding a dish towel when he said it, and the sentence had landed somewhere deep and stayed there long after the divorce papers were signed, after the apartment was divided, after Paul had moved to Seattle and remarried within 18 months. Diane had not remarried. She had not particularly tried. She had made partner earned a board seat and filled her evenings with enough work that the quiet at home rarely had the chance to ask too many questions. Her closest friend was Rachel Holt, who had known Diane since graduate school and who had appointed herself entirely without invitation as the one person in Diane's life who refused to let her disappear into her own competence. Rachel worked in marketing, lived in Lincoln Park with her husband and their aging rescue dog, and had an almost professional-grade ability to meddle with such genuine warmth that it was nearly impossible to stay angry at her for long. Nathan's best friend was Derek Walsh. They had worked together at Kellerman for 7 years, played pickup basketball on Saturday mornings whenever the weather cooperated, and Derek had watched Nathan quietly reassemble his life after Laura, with the kind of steady sideline attention that never quite stopped worrying about what it saw. The 4 of them had no natural overlap, no shared gym, no neighborhood coffee shop, no mutual colleague who might have introduced them at a happy hour. The only thread connecting Nathan Cole and Diane Calloway was the particular conspiratorial certainty of 2 people who had decided that their closest friends had been alone long enough. Derek texted Nathan at 2:47 on a Tuesday afternoon, while Nathan was at his desk reviewing load calculations for a pedestrian bridge project outside Milwaukee. The message was short and worded, with the casual ease Derek used whenever he was trying not to appear deliberate. It read, "Big potential client. Tonight. Rosewood on Michigan Avenue. 7 o'clock. Table's under your name. Don't wear the flannel." Nathan read it twice, typed back a question mark, and received no response for the next 4 hours. He didn't think much of it. Client introductions had come through Derek, before Derek knew half of Chicago through his fraternity network, and 11 years of aggressive professional networking. And so Nathan finished the bridge calculations, shut down his computer, told Claire he'd be home by 9, and asked their neighbor Mrs. Patterson to check in on her. He ironed his one presentable shirt in the bathroom mirror, while Claire stood in the doorway, watching him with a small, observant expression he pretended not to notice. Rachel had managed Diane's end of the evening with considerably more detail and care. She had called at noon, catching Diane on a walk back from a client lunch, and delivered the story in the calm, professional register she reserved for things she wanted Diane to agree to before Diane had a chance to think them through properly. She described a candidate highly recommended strong background in operations finance, who had an unexpected window that evening and specifically preferred an informal dinner setting rather than a formal interview, because Rachel explained he worked better in relaxed environments. She provided the restaurant name, the time, and the table reservation. She told Diane to ask for the table under Cole. Diane had written it in her calendar before she had fully processed whether she had actually agreed, which was, Rachel knew from over 2 decades of friendship exactly how you got Diane Calloway to do anything at all. By 6:45, Nathan was parking 2 blocks from Rosewood. By 6:50, Diane was stepping out of a car service in a charcoal blazer with her leather notebook under her arm. Neither of them had any way of knowing that Derek and Rachel were already inside, seated at a table near the back, behind a large potted olive tree phones, face up on the tablecloth, and absolutely silent, watching the entrance with the barely contained energy of 2 people who had planned something for weeks and were now holding their breath to see whether it would land. Nathan reached the host stand first. He gave his name. The host led him to a table for 2 near the window, with a small votive candle, 2 menus, and a white folded card propped between the salt and pepper shakers. He sat down, reached for his water glass, and then Diane walked in. She spotted him when the host gestured toward the window table, and for one fraction of a second, her expression shifted. A small, calibrating pause before it settled back into the smooth composure she had spent years developing. She crossed the room, extended her hand, said her name with the unhurried confidence of someone who introduced herself for a living. Nathan stood, shook her hand, gave his name back. They sat down at almost the same moment, which would have looked coordinated if either of them had been thinking about anything other than the white card between the salt and pepper shakers that Nathan reached for first. It was a folded piece of cardstock, and on the inside, in Derek's handwriting, Nathan recognized the leftward slant. Immediately it read, "Relax. Eat something. You're welcome. D&R. Nathan set the card flat on the table between them and said nothing for a moment. Diane looked at it, then looked at him, then turned her head in the slow and deliberate way of someone scanning for a face they already suspect they'll find. He followed her gaze. Behind the olive tree near the back of the restaurant, Derek's hand rose in a small wave and dropped immediately out of sight. Nathan looked back at the table. He exhaled once. Diane lifted her leather notebook from her lap and set it on the empty chair beside her, a gesture that felt to Nathan like the physical equivalent of a decision, like setting something down that had been held for a while. They looked at each other across the candlelight, 2 strangers who had each been steered here by someone else's confidence, and the question hanging between them was identical for both: stay or go. Nathan picked up his menu. He opened it, looked at the appetizers without really seeing them, and said without looking up, "I haven't been to Rosewood in about 4 years. The lamb is good if you eat lamb." It was not an invitation exactly. It was not a dismissal either. It was just something small and honest, a side door, rather than a main entrance a way in if she wanted it. Diane opened her menu and said, "I eat lamb." And that was the whole of the decision. The first 20 minutes were careful. They ordered from the same section of the menu. She chose the roasted lamb with white bean puree. He chose the braised short rib, and they talked the way two people talk when they are both experienced at being professional in unfamiliar situations, which meant they talked mostly about work. Nathan described the Milwaukee Bridge project in plain terms, without jargon the way he had learned to do over years of presenting to city planning boards. Diane described Meridian's expansion into the Pacific Northwest with the polished fluency of someone who had made the same pitch to a dozen different rooms. They were genuinely interested in each other's work, in the way that capable people are always mildly interested in what other capable people do for a living. But there was a performance quality underneath it, and they both felt it. And because they both felt it, there was a low-grade self-consciousness running beneath every sentence, a slight delay between thought and word, the subtle awareness of being observed even when the observers were hidden behind a potted plant on the other side of the room. The food came. The candle burned down a little. Diane asked a follow-up question about the Milwaukee Bridge, something precise about soil load tolerances near lakeside foundations, and Nathan looked up from his plate with an unguarded flicker of surprise, the expression of a man who realizes he is being listened to rather than merely heard. He answered in detail. She asked a second question. He set his fork down without thinking about it, and began to use his hands as he talked, which was something he did when he was genuinely engaged in something, and not just being courteous, and he did not notice he was doing it, which was the most honest thing that had happened at the table so far. The conversation moved without either of them having to push it forward, and neither of them acknowledged this, because naming it would have changed it. Then Nathan's phone buzzed face up on the table, and his face did the particular thing that a father's face does when his child calls a micro shift, almost invisible something between alert and softened all at once. He looked at Diane and said, "I'm sorry, it's my daughter. I'll just be a moment." He stood and moved toward the windows near the entrance, and Diane reached for her water glass and looked at nothing in particular. She could not hear the call from where she sat. What she could see was the shape of him standing near the window, shoulders dropped, head slightly bowed. The posture of a man who had just become entirely himself. She could see his free hand moving as he spoke, the same hands gesturing habit, but slower, now, softer. She looked down at the leather notebook on the chair beside her. The pages were blank. She had not written a single thing all evening, and it occurred to her, only now, that she hadn't noticed until this moment. When Nathan returned to the table and sat down again, he said, "Sorry about that. She just wanted to make sure I found parking all right." He said it lightly, not laboring the point, and picked up his fork. Diane looked at him for a beat longer than she had intended to, then looked back at her own plate. After a moment, she asked, "How old is she?" The question was not professional. It was not the language of networking or assessment. It was the kind of question you ask when you have stopped pretending to be somewhere other than where you actually are. Nathan said, 13, going on about 35. He smiled when he said it, and it was a different smile than any he had produced earlier in the evening, tireder, more real, the smile of someone who had packed more years into the last 4 than most people manage in 10. They had been there for an hour and 10 minutes when Diane said it. She had not planned to say it. She had been listening to Nathan describe how Claire had taught herself to make French press coffee at age 12 because she had read somewhere that it tasted better than drip. And Diane was in the middle of a genuine, unself-conscious laugh when the question arrived in her mind and came out of her mouth before she had decided whether to let it go. She said, "Do you ever think about dating again?" The table went quiet. Not the uneasy quiet of two strangers who have said too much, but the settling quiet that falls when both people recognize that the register of a conversation has shifted, that they have moved from the shallows into water, with more depth and less footing beneath it. Nathan set his glass down. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at her. "I think about it," he said, "and then I think about Claire watching me think about it. And I stop." His thumb moved along the base of the water glass, a small, absent gesture. "She lost her mom when she was 9. I don't want her to feel like I'm trying to replace something." He stopped before the end of the sentence, and the silence that followed was denser than the one before it, the kind that comes from a thought that ran out of words before it ran out of meaning. He didn't finish it. He didn't need to. Diane understood precisely where the sentence had been going, and the fact that he had left it unfinished was somehow more honest than if he had delivered the whole thing cleanly. She had met people who could talk about loss with a smooth, practiced fluency, and people who couldn't. The ones who couldn't were always the ones who actually meant it. "My ex-husband told me I was too ambitious to make someone feel needed," Diane said. She said it the way she said most things evenly, without decorative framing. But there was a flatness in it that was not indifference. It was the particular flatness of a sentence that has been lived with long enough to stop hurting sharply and start hurting in the dull background way instead. "I don't know if he was wrong about that," she added. Nathan looked at her with the unhurried attention of someone who was genuinely considering what she had just said, rather than preparing the next thing he was going to say in response. He said after a pause, "I think there's a real difference between ambition and self-sufficiency. I think people confuse them, because it's easier than examining which one actually frightened them." Diane looked at him across the table. It was the most precisely accurate thing anyone had said about her situation in 2 years, and he had said it without effort, without knowing her history, without the benefit of a single shared meal before this one. She reached for her wine glass and held it without drinking from it. The conversation did not become heavy after that. It did not overload itself with the weight of what had been said. It simply became different, more direct, more honest. The kind of conversation that sometimes happens when two people have each accidentally revealed something true within the same 10 minutes, and there is no longer any reason to perform. They talked about grief in the particular unglamorous daily life terms, the way silence acquires a different quality in a house after someone is gone from it, the way you can forget for 30 seconds and then remember and have to absorb the loss all over again as if for the first time. They talked about the odd freedom of being alone and the odd loneliness that lives inside that same freedom. They talked about what they were each actually good at and what they were each quietly failing at, and neither of them dressed any of it up. The breadbasket was empty. The candle had reached its last centimeter. Neither of them had looked at a phone in close to 40 minutes. Behind the olive tree, Derek and Rachel sat with their entrees going cold, exchanging glances that were mostly triumphant, but also quietly moved, because whatever they had hoped for when they arranged this evening, what they were watching was better than what they had hoped for. It was Rachel who moved first. At 8:53, Nathan would check the timestamp on his phone later and remember it exactly. Rachel and Derek appeared at the edge of the table with the unmistakable energy of people who have been holding themselves back for a long time and have finally run out of patience. Derek had his hand on Nathan's shoulder before Nathan fully registered they were there. Rachel was already talking in the bright, rushed way of someone who expected to be forgiven, immediately saying something about knowing it was a lot. But they had both seemed so clearly lonely, and she had simply had this feeling. And wasn't it a little bit wonderful how everything had come together? She was beaming. Derek was grinning. They were both leaning in, and the private thing that had been carefully building over the past hour and 40 minutes, that particular undefended quality of a table where two people have stopped performing for anyone, collapsed all at once, like a room where someone has thrown the door open too hard. Nathan looked at Derek. Derek's grin began to recede just slightly at the edges. Nathan did not say anything, which said everything. Diane had already gone quiet in a way that was entirely different from the comfortable quiet of 20 minutes before. This was the quiet of a woman who had spent 2 years carefully reconstructing her ability to trust her own instincts, who had arrived at this restaurant with a leather notebook and a professional errand, and had, without planning any of it, done something considerably more vulnerable than that, and who was now sitting at a table being looked at by 2 people who had stage-managed the whole evening and were waiting to be thanked for their cleverness. She reached for her jacket on the back of her chair. She looked at Rachel with a precision in her expression that was almost worse than anger, and said, "You were recording us." Rachel started to say it was only a few seconds, just a short clip, barely anything, but Diane was already standing. She thanked the waiter who happened to be passing. She put on her jacket with the efficient composure of a person who has left rooms before and knows exactly how to do it, without losing a single thing. She looked at Nathan once, not unkindly, but briefly the kind of look that carries an apology without specifying what the apology is for. And then she walked through the front door of Rosewood and was gone. Nathan stayed at the table for a moment longer. The waiter brought the check and set it near him. He reached for it without looking at Derek. Derek said with careful lightness, "I mean, you two seem to really be hitting it off, man." Nathan set his card on the folder. He said, "Yeah, we were." The flatness in his voice was complete, and Derek heard every word of it. He did not sleep well that night. He lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and thought about none of the large things. Not grief and not 4 years of quiet dinners, not the long arithmetic of everything that had been lost, but about something very small and specific. He thought about the way Diane had reached for her wine glass and held it without drinking from it. He thought about the sound of her voice when she repeated Paul's words back aloud, the particular flatness in it that was not coldness, but something older and more worn than coldness. He thought about the blank pages in her notebook and the way she had set it on the empty chair beside her, like she was letting go of something she had been gripping for a while. He thought about that last look at the table, not closed, not angry, just contained, and he could not determine whether it meant anything at all, or was simply the practiced face of someone who had learned to exit situations cleanly. At some point, he fell asleep. In the morning, he felt the specific tiredness of a night spent thinking in circles and producing nothing. Claire was in the kitchen when he came downstairs pouring cereal into a bowl and not looking at him, which meant she had already read his face when he came through the doorway and had decided she knew what she needed to know. She let him pour his coffee. She let him sit. Then she said, without looking up from her breakfast, "How was the client dinner?" Nathan wrapped both hands around his mug and said, "There was no client." Claire looked up at that. She watched him for a long moment with the expression she wore when she was deciding whether to ask the next question or let it rest. She let it rest. She ate her cereal. Nathan drank his coffee. The kitchen held the particular quiet of a small house with only 2 people in it. 3 days passed. Derek texted twice and called once, and Nathan let all of it go unanswered, not from real anger, but from the particular exhaustion of not yet having words for something. On the 4th day, he received a message forwarded through Derek from Rachel, who apparently did not have Nathan's number directly. "I'm so sorry. Please tell Nathan I'm so sorry. I shared a clip, and I should never have done that. And Diane saw it, and I know that's why she left. I feel awful about it." Nathan read this standing outside the Kellerman building on his afternoon break in the November cold, with his coat unbuttoned, and understood at once what had happened and exactly why Diane's face at the end of the evening had been the particular shape that it was. He had been ready to let the evening sit and become nothing the way he had learned to let most things sit and become nothing over the last 4 years. But this detail changed the specific architecture of what had gone wrong, and it mattered to him in a way he couldn't fully dismiss. He did not have her number. He did not know her building or her address. What he had was her last name and the name of her company, which were not difficult to find. And the knowledge that going there to her place of business, unannounced, without introduction, was almost certainly not the kind of thing a sensible, measured person would do. He went inside and sat at his desk and got back to work. He stayed focused through the rest of that day and the next morning and most of the following afternoon, and he was almost entirely convincing about it, until Thursday evening, when Claire found him standing at the kitchen window at 8:30 at night, with an empty mug in his hand, looking out at the dark yard, with the expression she associated with him, thinking hard about something he was not going to mention unless she drew it out of him. She sat down at the kitchen table. She opened her textbook. She read 2 pages in silence. Then she said, without any particular lead-up, "Dad, if there's something you're trying to talk yourself out of, just don't." Nathan turned from the window. Claire was not looking at him. She turned a page in her book. "You ironed your shirt that night," she said. "You never iron your shirt unless I specifically ask you to." Nathan looked at his daughter for a long time, this 13-year-old with her mother's eyes and her father's silences and her own particular irreducible wisdom. And he did not say anything because she had already said the thing he needed to hear, and there was nothing left to add to it. Meridian Logistics occupied the top 3 floors of a glass and steel building on South Wacker Drive. Nathan stood on the sidewalk outside it on a Friday morning at 8:45, hands in his coat pockets, the wind off the river working through the corridor between buildings with the full indifferent force of a Chicago November. He had not called ahead. He had no cover story and no prepared argument. What he had was a piece of paper folded into quarters in his left coat pocket, something he had written at the kitchen table the previous evening while Claire did homework at the other end of the table, and which he had rewritten 3 times before the wording said exactly what he meant, and nothing more than that. He was not a man who made gestures or gave speeches. He dealt in the structural integrity of things, in whether the load distribution was correct, and whether the foundation would hold under what was being asked of it. He did not know, standing on South Wacker Drive with the wind in his face, whether this was structurally sound, or whether he was miscalculating the whole situation completely. But he had stood at enough worksites to know that there is a point at which you stop running the numbers and start trusting what you built. He walked into the lobby. The front desk was staffed by a young man in a blazer who looked at him with the politely interrogating expression of someone trained to manage exactly this kind of unannounced arrival. Nathan said clearly that he did not have an appointment, that he was not there for a scheduled meeting, and that he had something he would like passed along to Diane Calloway if that was something they could arrange. He set the folded piece of paper on the counter. The young man looked at the note, then at Nathan, with the calibrating expression of someone trying to determine whether this was a problem or not. Nathan looked back in the calm, unhurried way of a man who had decided, before he walked in the door, that however the next 5 minutes went was exactly how they were going to go. The young man picked up the desk phone. Nathan moved to one of the lobby chairs and sat down with his coat still buttoned and waited. 5 minutes later, the elevator opened and Diane Calloway walked out. She was in a darker blazer than the night at Rosewood, more formal Friday morning on South Wacker, and she was holding his folded note in one hand, still creased at the quarters apparently unread. She crossed the lobby and stopped a few feet from where he was sitting, and he stood because it seemed like the right thing to do. She looked at the note in her hand, then at him. The front desk said Nathan Cole, she said. Non-emergency. He said, "That's accurate." She said, "You came to my office." He said, "I didn't have your number." There was a pause. She said, "You could have asked Derek for it." He said, "I didn't want it from Derek." The lobby moved around them, other people crossing the floor, elevator doors opening and closing, the ambient working noise of a building in the middle of its Friday, but the few feet of space between them held a quiet with its own particular quality. Diane looked at him for a long moment. She said, "I saw what Rachel filmed." Nathan said, I know. I'm not here about that. I'm not here to apologize on her behalf. Diane's chin came up slightly, a small, involuntary adjustment. Nathan continued without rushing it. I'm here because the last time I sat across a table from someone and felt like a conversation was going somewhere real, it was 4 years ago, and I didn't want to let what happened the other night just sit there and become nothing, because it wasn't nothing. He paused for a moment. That's all. That's the whole thing. Diane looked at him. She looked at the folded note still in her hand, then back at him. What does the note say? He said, the same thing. I wrote it down because I was worried I'd say it wrong out loud. She held the paper for another moment, then said quietly, You didn't say it wrong. She looked at the lobby, then at the elevator, then back at him, the expression of a woman running a calculation that has more variables than usual in it. She said, I have a 9:30. Nathan said, I know. I'm not asking you to move anything. She said, There's a coffee place across the street. He said, I saw it on the way in. She said, They're open. He waited. She looked at him one more time, with an expression that had moved over the course of the conversation, from unreadable to something closer, to resolved, not warm, yet not open yet, but resolved, the particular look of a woman who has made a decision she intends to stand behind. She said, Give me 5 minutes. She turned and walked back to the elevator. The doors closed. Nathan sat back down in the lobby chair, unbuttoned the top button of his coat, and waited. The coffee place was called Wren and Mill, and it had exposed brick walls, mismatched wooden chairs, and background jazz kept low enough not to interfere with anything. Nathan was already there when Diane came through the door 7 minutes after she had said, 5 coat on bag over her shoulder, phone face down in her hand, in the deliberate posture of someone who has decided, at least temporarily, not to be reachable. He stood when she came in. She registered it and said nothing about it. They ordered at the counter. She took hers. Black, he added a pour of cream and found a table near the window that looked out onto South Wacker and the gray November sky pressing low over the city. They did not go back over the dinner at Rosewood directly. They did not revisit Rachel's recording, or Derek's grin, or the moment at the end of the evening when the privacy of the table had been punctured and Diane had left with her jacket and her composure perfectly intact. All of that was present underneath the conversation, the way a building's foundation is present, beneath everything constructed on top of it, invisible from above, but bearing all the weight. What they talked about instead was the particular shape of a Friday morning, and the coffee which was better than either of them had expected, and the way the glass building across the street caught the gray light at a certain angle, in a way that was almost interesting enough to mention. They talked about small things, easy things, the kinds of things two people talk about when they are not trying to prove anything or explain anything, but are simply establishing that they can occupy the same space without performance. Nathan told her that Claire had been the one who finally made him come. He said it simply as a plain fact that his 13-year-old had told him not to talk himself out of it, that she had noticed he ironed his shirt the night of the dinner without being asked, and that this single observation had been enough to make her case without any other argument. Diane listened to this with both hands around her mug, and her expression did something quiet and specific that was not quite a smile, but lived in the same neighborhood, the look of someone who has just learned something small that will take a while to finish understanding. She said, She sounds like someone worth listening to. Nathan said, She usually is. He said it with the specific combination of exhaustion and pride that a single father carries in equal measure after enough years, the weight and the warmth of it having become indistinguishable from each other a long time ago. Diane said after a moment of stillness that she had almost not come down from the elevator. She said it not as a confession, but as a fact, offered without apology the way she offered most things, because she was a person who said the true thing rather than the comfortable one. She said she had stood there, holding his folded note, and had nearly gone back upstairs to send word through the front desk that she was unavailable. Nathan said he knew she had been deciding because she had stood there for 10 full seconds before she said anything, and he had used those 10 seconds to make his own quiet decision that however she responded, he was going to accept it, because the alternative to coming at all would have been worse. She looked at him across the small table and said, "Most people don't give you the 10 seconds." He said, "Most people aren't trying to build something that needs to hold weight." At 9:14, Diane looked at the time and picked up her bag. Nathan stood. They were on the sidewalk outside Wren and Mill on South Wacker Drive, with the wind coming off the river and moving between the buildings around them and the city, carrying on its ordinary Friday business in every direction. Neither of them said anything for a moment that lasted a beat longer than the situation required. Then Diane said, "I don't have plans Saturday evening." She said it in the same, even declarative tone she used for everything else. Not coy, not tentative, just direct and clear in the way she was. Direct and clear about most things, as though having spent 2 years deciding what she actually wanted, had stripped away any interest she might have had in obscuring it. Nathan said, "I don't either." She said, "Somewhere without an olive tree if possible." He said, "I'll find somewhere without an olive tree." She turned and walked back toward her building. Nathan stood on the sidewalk and watched her go the gray city morning all around him, and felt something settle in him that he did not immediately have a name for. Not relief, not happiness, not any of the large declarative emotions, but something quieter than all of those and more structural. Something like the feeling of weight properly distributed. Something like a foundation that was going to hold. He turned and walked in the other direction toward the parking garage where his 2014 Civic was waiting with its cracked rear bumper. He thought walking that he might finally get that bumper fixed. Not immediately, but soon. It was the kind of repair he thought that you stop putting off when you start believing the car is going somewhere worth arriving at. 3 blocks away in a coffee shop on Adams Street, where they had retreated after leaving Rosewood the previous week, and where they had been sitting now for close to an hour, waiting for a text that had not come. Derek and Rachel sat across from each other, with mugs that had gone cold on the table between them. Rachel's phone buzzed. She looked at it. She looked at Derek. She turned the screen so he could read the message from Diane. 4 words. Dinner. Saturday. Be good. Rachel set the phone face down on the table and covered her mouth with one hand. Derek leaned back in his chair and let out a long breath that felt like it had been held for the better part of a week. Outside on Adams Street, Chicago moved on in its ordinary, relentless Friday way, and 2 people who had each spent several years learning how to be alone had quietly, carefully, without a single dramatic moment to mark it, decided to try something else.